History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now. You probably think you know Cleopatra the 7th, right? The seductive queen of Egypt, the most powerful woman in the ancient world. The exotic beauty who conquered Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with her irresistible charm. Whoa, prepare to have that romantic fantasy completely shattered. Because the real Cleopatra was such a brutal and manipulative, calculating psychopath that she would make the cruelest modern dictators seem like amateurs in comparison. Here's the first truth that will blow your perception apart. Cleopatra was an Egyptian. She was 100% Macedonian Greek, a direct descendant of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. For over 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty maintained their racial purity through systematic incest between siblings. A practice so extreme that Cleopatra was more genetically related to Alexander than to any actual Egyptian. And unlike Hollywood representations, she probably wasn't even remotely beautiful by ancient or modern standards. But wait, it gets much worse. Contemporary historical sources describe Cleopatra as having common appearance at best. Angular face, prominent nose, and an extremely high-pitched voice that many foreign ambassadors found irritating. Coins from the era show a woman with harsh features and nothing attractive about them. Her supposed irresistible beauty was pure political propaganda, created centuries later by Roman rioters who romanticized her story. And here's the truly disturbing part. Cleopatra achieved power not through charm or superior intelligence, but through a systematic campaign of assassinations, betrayals, and psychological manipulation that began when she was only 14 years old. Her first victim was her own younger sister, Arsinoe, for whom she ordered executed because she represented a potential threat to the throne. It was under quick political assassination. Cleopatra forced Arsinoe to watch the execution of all her supporters first, one by one, before finally allowing her own death. The real Cleopatra was a master of psychological terror, who used fear as her primary political tool. She invented execution methods so creative and prolonged that foreign ambassadors frequently canceled diplomatic visits after hearing descriptions of her special audiences. One of her favorite practices was forcing political rivals to choose between different forms of death: slow poisoning, crucifixion, or being eaten alive by sacred crocodiles, while she watched and took notes on their reactions for future use. Most terrifying of all is that Cleopatra developed her reputation as a seductress not through physical beauty, but through psychological manipulation, so sophisticated that powerful men literally became addicted to her presence. She obsessively studied the psychological weaknesses of every man she needed to control, then created personalized experiences that exploited their fears, secret desires, and insecurities, until they became completely dependent on her approval. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were conquered by love. They were psychologically broken and then rebuilt as obedient puppets. The woman Hollywood portrays as a romantic heroine was actually one of the most efficient sociopaths in ancient history, who transformed seduction into an exact science of psychological domination and used that skill to manipulate two of Rome's most powerful men until they destroyed their own careers serving Egyptian interests. You're about to discover how a Greek teenager with no special physical beauty became the most feared woman in the Mediterranean world through methods that would make modern serial killers feel nauseous. If you thought sibling rivalry was just normal teenage jealousy, prepare to discover how Cleopatra transformed family conflicts into a systematic extermination campaign that would make modern serial killers look like amateurs in planning and execution. We'd be talking about a teenager who orchestrated the murder of 4 different siblings over the course of a decade, using methods so cruel and psychologically sadistic that they traumatized even professional executioners accustomed to extreme violence. Ptolemaic tradition required siblings to rule together through incestuous marriage. But Cleopatra had other plans from the moment she assumed power at age 18. Her first victim was Ptolemy XIII, her brother husband, who was only 10 years old. Here is something that will shock you deeply. She did simply assassinate him. She orchestrated a psychological terror campaign that lasted months, convincing the child that she was his only protection against invisible enemies before finally poisoning him during a dinner she personally prepared. But wait, the truly diabolical part was how Cleopatra used each assassination as a public demonstration of power. When her second brother, Ptolemy XIV, began questioning her political decisions at age 15, she did unjust order his death. She forced the entire royal court to watch while he was slowly poisoned with a substance that caused agonizing convulsions for hours. Cleopatra sat beside the deathbed, taking notes on his symptoms and timing exactly how long each phase of agony lasted, claiming she was studying the will of the gods. And here's the truly disturbing part. Cleopatra developed unique assassination methods for each sibling based on their individual personalities and specific fears. Orsino, who had shown military courage, was forced to witness the brutal execution of all her loyal soldiers, before being slowly strangled with a rope made from the hair of her own dead servants. The process took 3 days, with Cleopatra personally visiting Orsino multiple times to check her progress and offer water only to prolong her agony. The most terrifying aspect was how she meticulously documented each murder for future reference. Cleopatra maintained a detailed diary describing the emotional and physical reactions of each victim, which she used to refine her psychological torture methods. Foreign ambassadors who gained access to portions of this diary reported content so disturbing that some developed permanent insomnia after reading just a few paragraphs. Cleopatra's family extermination campaign was simply about political power. It was about establishing a reputation for such extreme cruelty that no one would ever dare challenge her again. She correctly calculated that murdering her own family in particularly horrific ways would send an unequivocal message to any future rival. If she was capable of torturing children who shared her blood to death, what would she do to strangers? The most shocking aspect was how Cleopatra justified these murders through elaborate religious propaganda. She claimed each death was a necessary sacrifice to the gods to protect Egypt, and forced priests to perform ceremonies that blessed each execution. Some priests who refused to participate mysteriously disappeared, with their bodies found weeks later in conditions suggesting prolonged torture. The cruelest irony is that Cleopatra carefully preserved the appearance of appropriate mourning after each assassination. She organized elaborate funerals, wept publicly, and commissioned memorial statues for each murdered sibling, all while secretly celebrating the elimination of another threat to her absolute power. The woman Hollywood portrays as a tragic victim of political circumstances was actually one of the most methodical serial killers in ancient history, who used family bonds as a laboratory to perfect assassination techniques she would later apply on a much larger scale against political enemies and entire populations who dared oppose her reign of terror. Her systematic elimination of family members established a template of psychological warfare that influenced tyrants for millennia. Cleopatra proved that the most effective way to terrorize enemies was to demonstrate complete lack of human empathy, even toward those closest to you. She transformed familial love into a weakness to be exploited, and showed the world that absolute power required the complete abandonment of basic human decency. If you thought ancient royal banquets were just elegant parties with exotic food, prepare to discover how Cleopatra transformed diplomatic dinners into psychological horror spectacles, where foreign ambassadors were forced to watch elaborate tortures while trying to maintain civilized political conversations. We're talking about a queen who invented the concept of sadistic entertainment centuries before any modern dictator, using human suffering as performance art to intimidate guests and demonstrate absolute power. Cleopatra's most disturbing specialty was her educational dinners, events where she presented different execution methods as lessons on Egyptian justice for visiting diplomats. Here's something that will chill you. She did simply execute prisoners during these ceremonies. She created elaborate narratives where each victim represented a historical enemy of Egypt, and their specific torture demonstrated how traitors had been punished throughout the centuries. Ambassadors were required to applaud each cruel innovation, as if they were watching educational theater. But wait! The truly diabolical part was how Cleopatra personalized the tortures based on her guests' nationalities. When hosting Roman diplomats, she presented executions of captured Roman spies using methods specifically designed to terrorize Latin minds. Inverted crucifixion, where victims hung upside down for days, or forced feeding, where prisoners were compelled to eat until their stomachs literally exploded. For Greek guests, she recreated classical tortures mentioned in ancient texts, but with sadistic modifications that amplified the suffering. And here is the truly terrifying part. Cleopatra maintained a detailed torture menu that corresponded exactly to the dishes served during each banquet. If dinner included fish, prisoners were slowly eaten alive by Nile piranhas while guests dined. If pork was served, victims were gradually roasted on rotating spits, with Cleopatra casually explaining ideal temperatures for cooking different parts of the human body. Diplomats frequently vomited, but were forced to continue eating under penalty of becoming the next entertainment. The most disturbing aspect was how Cleopatra treated these tortures as genuine educational opportunities. She provided detailed commentary on human anatomy, while victims were dissected alive, explained the effects of different poisons during slow poisonings, and demonstrated physics principles using elaborate torture devices. Some ambassadors reported that she seemed genuinely enthusiastic about sharing scientific knowledge derived from her experiments in human suffering. Cleopatra also developed interactive games where guests were forced to participate directly in the tortures. She created creativity contests where diplomats had to suggest modifications to execution methods, with the winner receiving the privilege of personally applying the suggested torture. Refusing to participate resulted in immediate addition to the future victim list. Experienced ambassadors began studying torture methods before visiting Egypt, knowing they would be tested on their creative knowledge in causing suffering. The most shocking part was how she documented her guests' reactions during these spectacles. Cleopatra maintained specialized scribes who recorded every facial expression, involuntary comment, and sign of discomfort shown by diplomats during the tortures. This information was compiled into detailed psychological profiles she used in future negotiations. If she knew a specific ambassador showed particular horror at one torture type, she would threaten to use that method against his country's citizens during diplomatic disputes. The cruelest irony was how Cleopatra justified these banquets as traditional Egyptian hospitality. She claimed demonstrating justice methods was a respectful way to educate visitors about local culture, and that any ambassador who became disturbed was showing offensive cultural ignorance. Some countries eventually stopped sending representatives to Egypt, preferring to conduct diplomacy through intermediaries who never needed to personally witness Cleopatra's entertainments. The woman Hollywood portrays as a sophisticated, seductive hostess was actually a sadist who transformed diplomatic protocols into psychological torture sessions, using human suffering as a negotiation tool and establishing precedents of cruelty that would influence dictators for millennia. Her educational dinners became so infamous that the mere mention of a royal Egyptian invitation was enough to cause panic in foreign courts for generations after her death. If you thought ancient royal banquets were just elegant parties with exotic food, prepare to discover how Cleopatra transformed diplomatic dinners into psychological horror spectacles, where foreign ambassadors were forced to watch elaborate tortures while trying to maintain civilized political conversations. We were talking about a queen who invented the concept of sadistic entertainment centuries before any modern dictator, using human suffering as performance art to intimidate guests and demonstrate absolute power. Cleopatra's most disturbing specialty was her educational dinners, events where she presented different execution methods as lessons on Egyptian justice for visiting diplomats. Here, S. Something that will chill you. She did unsimply execute prisoners during these ceremonies. She created elaborate narratives where each victim represented a historical enemy of Egypt, and their specific torture demonstrated how traitors had been punished throughout the centuries. Ambassadors were required to applaud each cruel innovation, as if they were watching educational theater. But wait. The truly diabolical part was how Cleopatra personalized the tortures based on her guests' nationalities. When hosting Roman diplomats, she presented executions of captured Roman spies, using methods specifically designed to terrorize Latin minds. Inverted crucifixion, where victims hung upside down for days, or forced feeding, where prisoners were compelled to eat until their stomachs literally exploded. For Greek guests, she recreated classical tortures mentioned in ancient texts, but with sadistic modifications that amplified the suffering. And here is the truly terrifying part. Cleopatra maintained a detailed torture menu that corresponded exactly to the dishes served during each banquet. If dinner included fish, prisoners were slowly eaten alive by Nile piranhas while guests dined. If pork was served, victims were gradually roasted on rotating spits, with Cleopatra casually explaining ideal temperatures for cooking different parts of the human body. Diplomats frequently vomited, but were forced to continue eating under penalty of becoming the next entertainment. The most disturbing aspect was how Cleopatra treated these tortures as genuine educational opportunities. She provided detailed commentary on human anatomy, while victims were dissected alive, explained the effects of different poisons during slow poisonings, and demonstrated physics principles using elaborate torture devices. Some ambassadors reported that she seemed genuinely enthusiastic about sharing scientific knowledge derived from her experiments in human suffering. Cleopatra also developed interactive games where guests were forced to participate directly in the tortures. She created creativity contests where diplomats had to suggest modifications to execution methods, with the winner receiving the privilege of personally applying the suggested torture. Refusing to participate resulted in immediate addition to the future victim list. Experienced ambassadors began studying torture methods before visiting Egypt, knowing they would be tested on their creative knowledge in causing suffering. The most shocking part was how she documented her guests' reactions during these spectacles. Cleopatra maintained specialized scribes who recorded every facial expression, involuntary comment, and sign of discomfort shown by diplomats during the tortures. This information was compiled into detailed psychological profiles she used in future negotiations. If she knew a specific ambassador showed particular horror at one torture type, she would threaten to use that method against his country's citizens during diplomatic disputes. The cruelest irony was how Cleopatra justified these banquets as traditional Egyptian hospitality. She claimed demonstrating justice methods was a respectful way to educate visitors about local culture, and that any ambassador who became disturbed was showing offensive cultural ignorance. Some countries eventually stopped sending representatives to Egypt, preferring to conduct diplomacy through intermediaries who never needed to personally witness Cleopatra's entertainments. The woman Hollywood portrays as a sophisticated, seductive hostess was actually a sadist, who transformed diplomatic protocols into psychological torture sessions, using human suffering as a negotiation tool and establishing precedents of cruelty that would influence dictators for millennia. Her educational dinners became so infamous that the mere mention of a royal Egyptian invitation was enough to cause panic in foreign courts for generations after her death. If you thought Cleopatra's seductive reputation was about natural charm or physical beauty, prepare to discover how she weaponized sexuality into the most sophisticated psychological manipulation system in ancient history. This wasn't romance. It was calculated destruction of powerful men's minds using their own desires, insecurities, and psychological weaknesses against them in ways that would make modern cult leaders seem like amateurs. Here rest the shocking truth that will destroy every romantic notion you had about Cleopatra. She did unseduce Julius Caesar and Mark Antony through beauty or genuine attraction. She created elaborate psychological profiles of each man's deepest insecurities, sexual fantasies, and emotional vulnerabilities. Then crafted personalized experiences designed to create psychological dependency that was stronger than any drug addiction. Caesar, obsessed with his receding hairline and aging body, was systematically convinced by Cleopatra that she found him more sexually attractive than any young Roman man. She hired actors to play Egyptian citizens who would accidentally praise Caesar's virility and sexual prowess whenever he was within earshot, creating a constant feedback loop of artificial validation. But wait, the manipulation went far deeper than simple flattery. Cleopatra studied Roman sexual customs and deliberately violated them in ways that made her seem exotic and forbidden. Two Roman men who had grown bored with conventional relationships. She introduced Caesar and Antony to sexual practices that were considered taboo in Roman culture, creating experiences so intense and unique that normal Roman women seemed bland and unsatisfying by comparison. This wasn't about pleasure. It was about creating addiction through contrast and novelty. And here is the truly diabolical part of her strategy. Cleopatra used sexual withholding as the most effective psychological torture ever devised. After creating intense physical and emotional dependency through weeks of constant availability and sexual gratification, she would disappear completely without explanation, leaving these powerful men desperate, confused, and psychologically broken. When she returned days or weeks later, they were so grateful and relieved that they'd agree to any political demand, sign any treaty, or make any concession just to ensure she wouldn't leave again. The systematic nature of her sexual manipulation was terrifyingly precise. Cleopatra maintained detailed records of each man's responses to different approaches, noting which techniques created the strongest emotional reactions and which timing strategies maximized psychological vulnerability. She treated seduction like a science, constantly experimenting with new methods of creating dependency and measuring their effectiveness through her target's political concessions. Mark Antony's case was particularly devastating. Cleopatra convinced him that Roman sexual customs were repressive, and that true masculine power required abandoning Roman values entirely. She created scenarios where Antony had to choose between Roman duties and sexual satisfaction with her, gradually training him to prioritize Egyptian interests over his own empire. Antony literally abandoned military campaigns multiple times just to chase after Cleopatra when she strategically withdrew her attention, leaving Roman legions leaderless while he desperately tried to regain her approval. The most disturbing aspect was how she used pregnancy and children as additional manipulation tools. Cleopatra timed her pregnancies to coincide with moments when Caesar and Antony were showing signs of independence from her influence. The prospect of offspring created biological and emotional bonds that made it even harder for these men to break free from her psychological control. She weaponized their paternal instincts as effectively as she had weaponized their sexual desires. Her sexual manipulation methods were so effective that both Caesar and Antony made catastrophic political decisions that ultimately destroyed their careers and reputations, all while genuinely believing they were acting from love and personal choice. Cleopatra had transformed the two most powerful men in Rome into psychological addicts who prioritized Egyptian interests over their own empire, their own families, and their own survival. The woman Hollywood portrays as a romantic figure was actually history's most successful predator, who proved that sexual manipulation could be more powerful than any army when wielded by someone completely without conscience or human empathy. If you thought Cleopatra's cruelty was limited to political executions and family murders, prepare to discover how she conducted systematic human experiments that would make Nazi doctors look like amateurs in comparison. She used her absolute power to satisfy scientific curiosity through methods that defied every concept of human decency and established precedents for medical horror that would be matched until the 20th century. Cleopatra maintained a private research facility hidden within her palace complex where she tested the effects of different poisons, surgical procedures, and torture methods on live subjects. But that's what makes this truly disturbing. These were UNT executions disguised as experiments. They were genuine scientific research conducted purely to satisfy her intellectual curiosity about human suffering and the limits of physical endurance. She wanted to understand exactly how each toxin affected human consciousness, pain perception, and physical deterioration, not for assassination purposes, but for the pure knowledge of how human beings could be destroyed in the most efficient ways possible. Her poison experiments were methodical and extensive. Cleopatra injected prisoners with various substances, while teams of scribes documented their reactions in real time, recording everything from initial symptoms to final death throes. She tested combinations of different toxins to see how they interacted, experimented with dosages to determine minimum lethal amounts, and even tried to develop antidotes by forcing subjects to consume potential remedies while being poisoned. Some experiments lasted 4 days, with subjects being kept barely alive to observe the complete progression of different toxic effects. But wait, her research into human pain thresholds was even more systematic and horrifying. Cleopatra developed what was essentially the world's first scientific approach to measuring how much suffering the human mind could endure before complete psychological breakdown. She used everything from controlled burning to surgical procedures performed without any pain relief, all while maintaining detailed records of each subject's psychological responses, behavioral changes, and the exact point at which they lost sanity or consciousness. And here's the most disturbing part of her experiments: her obsession with pregnancy, childbirth, and infant development. Cleopatra forced pregnant prisoners to give birth under various extreme conditions to study how stress, pain, and fear affected the birthing process and infant survival rates. She would induce premature labor through torture, perform crude cesarean sections on conscious women to observe internal anatomy, and even dissected newborns alive to examine their developmental stages and determine how long they could survive various surgical procedures. Her experiments on children were particularly systematic and horrifying. Cleopatra studied how young minds responded to different forms of trauma, testing theories about pain tolerance, psychological manipulation, and the breakdown of personality under extreme stress. She used orphaned children and prisoners' offspring as subjects, documenting how different ages responded to identical tortures, and whether psychological or physical abuse was more effective at creating lasting trauma. The most terrifying aspect was how she treated these experiments as legitimate scientific research. Cleopatra maintained extensive libraries of her findings, created detailed anatomical drawings based on her dissections, and even wrote theoretical treatises on human suffering that she shared with scholars throughout the Mediterranean. She genuinely believed she was advancing human knowledge and saw herself as a pioneering researcher who was willing to push ethical boundaries for the sake of scientific progress. These were isolated incidents of cruelty or momentary fits of sadistic rage. They were systematic scientific research programs conducted over years with the methodical precision of a modern laboratory. Cleopatra established what was essentially the world's first concentration camp devoted entirely to human experimentation, complete with specialized torture chambers, detailed record-keeping systems, and teams of assistants trained in specific research methods. The scope of her experiments expanded to include studies on starvation, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and psychological conditioning. She wanted to understand every aspect of human vulnerability and spent enormous resources developing new methods to exploit physical and mental weaknesses. Her research influenced torture and interrogation techniques used throughout the ancient world and established precedents for systematic cruelty that would echo through history. The woman Hollywood portrays as an intelligent and cultured ruler was actually history's first systematic practitioner of human experimentation on an industrial scale, who transformed scientific curiosity into an excuse for unprecedented sadism and proved that intellectual sophistication could make cruelty infinitely more refined and effective than simple brutality. History remembers Cleopatra's death as the ultimate tragic romance. The noble queen who chose to die with her beloved Asprey rather than face Roman humiliation, a woman who preferred death to dishonor in one final act of defiant dignity. The truth? It was the final, pathetic act of a coward who could unface even a fraction of the consequences for her crimes, and whose last hours revealed her to be exactly the selfish, manipulative monster she had always been. Here is the truth that will shatter every romantic notion about Cleopatra's death. When Octavian's forces surrounded Alexandria and her defeat became inevitable, she didn't nobly choose death for love or honor. She spent weeks desperately trying to negotiate her way out of consequences, offering to betray Mark Antony, surrender all Egyptian treasures, and even provide sexual services to Octavian in exchange for being allowed to keep some semblance of power. Her legendary pride and dignity completely vanished the moment she faced real consequences for her actions. But wait, the cowardice goes much deeper. When her attempts at negotiation failed, Cleopatra tried to seduce Octavian through a series of increasingly desperate letters, using the same psychological manipulation tactics that had worked on Caesar and Antony. She offered him detailed information about Roman military weaknesses she had learned from her previous lovers, promised to help him consolidate power over territories. She had influenced and even suggested ways he could eliminate his own political rivals using methods she had perfected in Egypt. And here's the most pathetic part. When seduction failed, Cleopatra attempted to fake her own death to escape responsibility entirely. She staged an elaborate suicide scene with a servant's corpse, hoping to convince Roman forces she was dead while she escaped through secret passages to live in exile. Only when this deception was discovered did she realize that every escape route had been exhausted, and that she would inevitably face Roman justice for decades of crimes. The truth about her actual suicide reveals the ultimate cowardice. Cleopatra did not choose death from noble principle. She chose it because she knew exactly what awaited her in Rome. And after decades of inflicting unspeakable tortures on others, she couldn't bear the thought of experiencing even a fraction of the suffering she had caused. Her suicide was unheroic. It was the act of someone who could dish out cruelty, but could untake even the possibility of facing consequences. But that's the most revealing detail about her final hours. Cleopatra's last act of cruelty was testing the ASPS venom on her own servants. She forced her most loyal attendants to be bitten first, then sat and watched them die in agony to ensure her own death would be quick and painless. Even facing death, she used other people's suffering to serve her own comfort and convenience. The woman who had spent her life torturing others could uneven die without causing unnecessary pain to innocent people. Her supposed love for Mark Antony was also revealed as manipulation in her final hours. When Antony was dying from his wounds, Cleopatra refused to see him or provide comfort, instead focusing entirely on her own escape plans. She showed no genuine grief or emotional connection. Only annoyance that his death complicated her political calculations. The great love story was revealed as nothing more than mutual manipulation between two sociopaths. The most damning evidence of her cowardice was how she spent her final weeks trying to destroy evidence of her crimes. Cleopatra ordered the burning of records documenting her human experiments, the execution of witnesses who could testify about her torture methods, and the destruction of her research libraries. She was more concerned with protecting her posthumous reputation than accepting responsibility for her actions. Even her choice of death method was calculated for maximum propaganda value. Cleopatra knew that dying from an aspa bite would create romantic symbolism that might overshadow her crimes in historical memory. She literally chose her suicide method based on how it would play to future generations, manipulating their own death as effectively as she had manipulated everything else in her life. The tragic irony is that her cowardly death actually succeeded in creating the romantic legend she intended by avoiding Roman justice and dying before she could be held accountable for her crimes. Cleopatra managed to escape the historical reckoning she deserved and transform herself from monster into martyr. Her final manipulation was the most successful one, convincing history itself that she was a tragic heroine rather than one of the most sadistic rulers who ever lived. The woman Hollywood portrays as dying for love was actually a coward who chose death over accountability, and whose final act was using her servants' suffering to ensure her own comfort even in suicide. So, there you have the devastating truth about one of history's most romanticized figures. Cleopatra VII wasn't the tragic seductress from Hollywood movies. She was a calculating psychopath who transformed murder, incest, torture, sexual manipulation, human experimentation, and cowardice into an exact political science that would make modern serial killers and dictators seem like beginners in comparison. The woman who supposedly died for love actually spent 2 decades systematically exterminating her own family members, conducting grotesque medical experiments on live subjects, using sexual manipulation as psychological warfare, and turning diplomatic dinners into torture spectacles. She did unconquer Julius Caesar and Mark Antony through beauty or charm. She mentally broke them using sophisticated psychological conditioning techniques, until they became obedient puppets, willing to destroy their own careers, their own empires, and their own reputations for Egyptian interests. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect is unjust what Cleopatra did. It is how successfully she manipulated history itself. For over 2,000 years, she managed to convince the world she was a romantic heroine, when she was actually one of the most efficient sociopaths who ever lived. She proved that with enough intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic planning, you can literally rewrite your own legacy from monster into martyr, from sadistic killer into tragic lover. The cruelest irony. Cleopatra achieved exactly what she calculated from the beginning: to be remembered forever, but not as the serial killing, torture enthusiast, psychopath she actually was. Instead, she is celebrated as a symbol of female power and beauty. The ultimate victory of a master manipulator who fooled not just her contemporaries, but history itself. Her true legacy wasn't the pyramids, the Ptolemaic dynasty, or advancing Egyptian civilization. It was proving that some human beings are capable of such extreme, systematic cruelty that they transcend our basic understanding of evil. She showed the world that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who look evil or act obviously insane. They are the ones who are intelligent enough to make their atrocities seem justified, sophisticated enough to turn sadism into science, and manipulative enough to convince future generations that they were actually heroes. Cleopatra's story is a warning that absolute power does unjust corrupt. It can transform human beings into creatures so fundamentally twisted that they operate outside normal moral categories entirely. She represents the terrifying possibility that intelligence and education, rather than preventing evil, can actually make it infinitely more refined, systematic, and devastating. And this is just one of many shocking truths that popular history prefers to keep buried beneath romantic mythology and Hollywood fantasy. If these disturbing facts about Cleopatra completely destroyed your perception of ancient heroines and made you question everything you thought you knew about historical figures, then you're ready to discover more secrets that will make this seem mild in comparison. Because the real history of humanity, it's far more terrifying than any horror movie could ever show. The truth about our most celebrated historical figures reveals that our capacity for evil has no limits, and that sometimes the people we retaught to admire most were actually the most monstrous individuals who ever lived. The next time someone mentions Cleopatra as an inspiration for female empowerment, or uses her as a symbol of ancient beauty and intelligence, remember what you've learned here. Because the real Cleopatra was ante-queen or a lover. She was a predator who happened to wear a crown and whose greatest achievement was convincing history to remember her as anything other than the monster she truly was. History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.